It's the Accounting Influencers podcast again with me, Rob Brown, with our very special guest today, Luke Fisher. We're going to introduce Luke in just a moment, but to remind you, the Accounting Influencers podcast goes out to 35,000 accounting, finance, tech professionals all over the world in 150 countries. And it is an interview-based show. We bring on guests that have something special to share with you in your professional life. And hopefully this week's guest is really going to add some value because we are talking about high-performing hybrid work cultures. And the guy to talk to on this is Luke Fisher. Luke, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for setting me up. I hope it's as good as the introduction.
Well, I've actually introduced guests before, and now we've got the legend that is Luke Fisher, and it just freaks people out, Luke, that they are put on such a high pedestal. But let's be honest, you've been in this game a while. For people that haven't come across you, tell us a bit about your world.
Yeah, sure. So I started the business a few years ago now, mostly centered around a trend in the talent market, which is the transition of power from the employer to the employee. And what that really means is that organizations used to compete, as many of your finance and accounting colleagues will know, around pay and pay increases. And now what we've found is that that move to flexibility and hybrid worlds fundamentally changed that basis of competition. So many are now relying on organizational culture and the promise for what it will be like to work in that organization that differentiates them from the market. The challenge they then face is they can say all of the right things and talk the talk. When it comes to walking the walk, the big challenge to overcome is that middle managers are largely the representative kind of driver of the culture within the organization, and how you take them from just that as a manager to somebody that's a real champion of the culture is quite a challenging area. So that's what we tend to help organizations with, is how do you improve your employee experience? How do you translate the vision that you've got for your culture into the reality of that experience for your people, by building leadership capability and supporting them in sustainably investing in people and culture.
There's so much in this, and it's very appropriate for the accounting finance sector at the moment. And you used to work at WorkplaceCulture, so you get a little sense of this world of the fintech industry that supports the accounting profession, who are the trusted advisors to businesses. From the way you look, and you work in a few different sectors, Luke, what kind of shape do you feel professional service firms are in generally? They're a service-based organization. They've got very technically super smart people. They're not always socially as apt as we want them to be. But can you speak on that at all?
I think, what shape are they in? I think, like most industries, it's mixed. Is the long and short of it. I think I was having just this conversation this morning, actually, about Monzo.
Yes.
And the basis by which Monzo has relied on to compete for talent. And
Monzo are a challenger bank, just for people that don't know. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. And they're about 1,000-ish people. And they're in a position where they've not only competed for talent out of the traditional banks, they would now be winning people from, Google or Facebook, or those that we would often admire as leading the way in terms of how they think about workplace culture. And the really interesting thing for me is how people like that are setting a new level of standard of expectation. But they are in the 2.5% on the top end of the distribution curve. So what does the middle look like? I mean, generally, the opportunity for knowledge-based workers in a financial services related industry is that they do have the luxury, we could say, of being able to work from anywhere, generally, as long as systems and security allow for it, compared to somebody that works in a supermarket that has to be on a checkout in order to do their work, and they have to be there when the customer needs them to be served. The heart of most of financial services now is technology, which creates this big unlock for employers and leaders to choose how do they want to run their organization. So I would say that they're well placed. I think you are right in your comment that from a social kind of standpoint, or maybe an emotional intelligence standpoint, or a consideration around what leadership means these days, there's often gaps and opportunities for work to be done to improve there. And I think that's the message that we're really championing, is command and control leadership. When you expected people to turn up to work because they're getting paid, is really a thing of the past because of this power transition. It's relatively easy, even in these tough economic times, to get another job. And you could probably get another job in this space for another 5 or 10 grand more. So why would they stay with you, or why would they join you if you're looking to attract them, is the key challenge.
And you said it at the beginning, the power has gone from the employer to the employee. So let's take an accounting firm, for example. It would be that you were privileged to get a job at an accounting firm.
Yep.
They were handing you your career on a plate. There'd be a partner track that was very well defined. You'd be at your desk for 10 to 15 years doing the work, serving your time, and then you'd get an equity kind of position, and so it goes. But with the great recalibration, the great resignation, people are not accepting that anymore. Talk to us about how the power has shifted to employees and how much choice they have now, Luke.
So I think a good example is a relatively small, startup company like ours. So since the pandemic, to be fair, we've largely been a flexible employer from day one.
Right.
The pandemic has meant that we were in a position where we utilize the office less, and now we've transitioned to a fully remote company. So we build in our ways of working, some rituals for connection and all of those things, because that's what we specialize in and what we're used to. But we've hired now in 6 countries, and we've got some exceptional people that have joined us, that if we said, within a 25-mile radius is all that we would expect to hire from, because that's where our office is, we would have been in a position where we would never have got those people.
Have you hired people that you've never met, Luke?
Yeah. It's funny, actually, we did a company social. We all went to Thorpe Park because we're grown-ups. We flew people in, from Latvia, from Ireland, from a couple of other socials. Some of the team from Germany have come in, and that was the first time I've met them. And I'd worked with them for, in some cases, like 2 years. But I think this is why companies like ours exist, right? There is a real risk that when there's high availability of companies that are willing to embrace flexible work, how we win the competition in that talent market for great people versus the next person is all about how you think about your ways of working that facilitate something that is more than just a transactional interaction. It's too easy these days when people are in a hybrid working environment to turn up to a Zoom chat, not even really a bit of personal chit chat, into the task at hand, get it done, get off onto your next one. There's no time in the day for interaction. And some of those things are what make work, is those human interactions where people feel like they're in it together. So it's a long-winded way, and I'm not sure I quite answered your question perfectly, but I think... Well,
I was hinting at the way employees now have the control. You are saying there that you can hire from anywhere. And accounting firms, for example, they're not just competing with other accounting firms now. We've got evidence that qualified accountants are coming out of accountancy and going into fintech and going into other industries and using their knowledge and their skills because they can work anywhere at any time. So that increases the competition for labor. And accounting firms are not good at competing because they've all got similar websites and similar employee value propositions and similar employee values, and it all looks and sounds the same. So how does a potential employee start to make good decisions on where they land?
In the main, it comes down to brand. And brand is, so if you look at what happened in a familiar market, which was marketing, where I came from, the power transitioned there from the retailer to the consumer. And that was largely a byproduct of e-commerce and the explosion of choice. So the basis of competition was no longer centered around price and convenience, which was I go to my high street and I pick the one that offers me the best deal. E-commerce forced a level of thinking around convenience for a new level that we had never seen or expected before for the consumer, which then meant that competition grew because you could access people from anywhere, or you could buy from brands from anywhere, which then meant that they had to differentiate on experience. So a load of these threads around design thinking, designing for the user, the employee, through an e-commerce lens with high availability of like behavioral insight of what worked and what didn't that you struggled with in person, has led to this really mature understanding of customer experience. What's now happening is the same is true. This power transition means that we have to stop thinking about the top-down enterprise in our design and how we think about differentiation for us as the company, and think about the same kind of principles in the employment market. So brand really is your promise and story to the individual, which most people will say, we'll pay you fairly, hygiene factor. You can work flexibly, now largely a hygiene factor, to be honest. Therefore, we'll differentiate based on our culture.
And just to be clear, Luke, for the audience, a hygiene factor is something that someone else has got that's not really a negotiation point.
It's not a motivating factor.
Right.
It's there's a level of kind of rational consideration over your salary level, but it might not be the make or break. So it's kind of like food and water in our day-to-day life.
It's a necessary, isn't it, in any job offer, but it's what you offer beyond that creates a more unique value proposition.
Exactly, which most are looking at culture. So what does it feel like to be a part of the company? Not what do you get access to, because then you tap into things like people's motivational drivers, which most people these days, someone like a Daniel Pink, if anyone's listened to or read any of his books, will talk to extrinsic and intrinsic motivational factors. In its simplest sense, extrinsic is things like pay or status of a partner title. Intrinsic motivators are around acting with autonomy, being in a position where you feel like you're continuing to make progress and developing yourself. How you convey that outside of your employment contract and into something that feels a bit more like your psychological contract, the commitment that you're making to the employee and to the organization. Largely in the main, people are promising a great place to work, which is how they're differentiating. How they then back that up so that they are less in the zone of all saying the same thing on their careers page, you're starting to get into, Glassdoor will give you reviews, which is why people are trying to actively manage their scores on a Glassdoor, for example, because with the power transition comes this sense of empowerment through information where employees can start to make the right decisions for them as they have choice. As soon as you have optionality, you can pick the one that feels most appropriate. And employers often, sadly, don't have the level of maturity when they're thinking about some of these things, about how are they actually going to differentiate. There's a great study from McKinsey that a lot of the employer is not fully understanding why employees are leaving them. And in their main, they believe that the employer, I can share it if you add stuff to show notes and so on.
Sure, please.
Is the employer believes that it's all around fair pay, whereas the employee looks to feeling valued by their manager, valued by the organization, a sense of belonging, caring and trusting teammates, and access to opportunity are the primary drivers most important for the employee. So you look at those factors and you talked in your careers page to, we want you to be in a position where you join our organization because it looks this amazing. And then you think about the first interview experience. Is the person late? Are they stuffy? Are they in a position where they are, welcoming? Your first day in the organization, your first 6 months in the organization. And then it starts to take this, talking the talk into really walking the walk. And that's the kind of stuff that would help companies get consistency and differentiation on.
And I don't often mention this on this podcast, Luke, but when I'm not being a podcast host, my business is that I do employer brand interviews for accounting firms. Okay, so you talk about firms not giving the proof and evidence that they are a great place to work. Now, who are the best storytellers there? It's the employees themselves. So I interview people at accounting firms and say, why is it great to work there? Well, we love the culture. Well, what's great about the culture? Well, they really, really make you feel like you belong. Yeah. Well, give me an example of that. And when that comes from the horse's mouth, as it were, that is true efficacy, proof evidence that that company, that firm is doing what it says it will do. And putting a few values on a website or saying, this is what we offer you, that doesn't go far enough, does it?
Yeah, it's so true. And I think there's much about how much do you differentiate when you're trying to attract people. It's how do you sustainably prove that you're different so somebody doesn't take the call to apply for another job and leave you, right?
Yeah.
And a large part of that is the environment that you're creating. And a big part of that is, if you've got a senior audience that listen to this, is the leadership obligation is to You know, in a service related industry, all of the value is in your people. Your people literally make or break, you know, the business.
Let's talk about leadership, because this is where you specialize and offer specific advice to companies. If I'm a leader in a firm that's pushing for hybrid working and my employees are asking for remote working possibilities, I'm responsible for driving culture. And I find it very difficult to drive culture when everyone's spread all over the planet. I'm exaggerating, but it is harder, isn't it, to get a sense of camaraderie and companionship and a unified, harmonious culture while people are not actually in the office. What are ways around that?
I think to pick up on just some of your language choice, I don't think it's harder. I think it's different.
Okay.
And the challenge that I think that we've had is that most of us have built successful careers on the way that we've always done things.
Yes.
And therefore our expected patterns of behavior that used to work that now don't make us feel like change is hard.
And accountants are classic for that. They've ran accounting firms the same way for many, many years, and double entry bookkeeping is as it's been for thousands of years. So, and the people that lead accounting firms generally are those 40, 50, 60 somethings, the baby boomers, and it's the way we've done it. But yes, we are in a new world, aren't we? Continue with that thought.
Yeah, so I think different is the case. And I think when most people look at like, what does a high performance culture look like? Through the pandemic, we were obsessed about productivity, which meant that we lent heavy on how do we drive effectiveness and efficiency out of our working patterns. And why people seem to be, or the argument most are making to drag people back to the office rather than embrace flexibility, is that there's been a lack of productivity, there's been a lack of connection. And I think when you look at there's very, very few kind of evidence-based arguments for what's actually driving this. And there was a great newsletter I read the other day that was, most of the reports are commissioned by kind of city centre or real estate based organisations that are advocating people to get back into the office because of all of the effects. And actually, when you look at the data from some of the people that have been evaluating this stuff long term through research, you know, often professors in universities, the primary cause of the reduction in productivity is as a consequence of employee attrition.
Right.
And it's because people are leaving, which means you have rehiring, retraining, reskilling costs of people to put them in a position where it harms overall productivity levels.
That makes sense.
Yeah, hopefully some of that starts to make sense. So I think it is different. How is it different? What we optimized for was these effectiveness habits. So when we collaboration for me basically breaks up into three simple parts. One is task, one is process, and one is people. Much of what we optimized for was getting the job done, so getting the task completed. Our processes evolved and changed a little bit, but we didn't think very much about our interaction habits. How do we communicate effectively in a hybrid working environment? How do we think about connection from a digital first standpoint? How do we increase transparency when loads of us might be sat at home thinking, does anyone even know what I'm doing today? Or am I getting any work done?
Does anyone care?
Does anyone care? Exactly. Like, did the thing that I do today matter at all or not? And the problem is if you look at high performance, there's typically two axes. One is effectiveness and one is around interaction quality.
Okay.
And top right, as most of these things typically are, is when you've got high levels of interaction quality and you've also got high level of good quality effectiveness habits. And it's those two things that you need to work on. Most of our understanding through forced kind of requirement through the pandemic was drive out effectiveness, ensure we can still get the job done. But most of us, especially in service-based organizations, are fueled by knowledge and therefore collaboration. So that interaction element is vital. So small things like sharing wins of the week on a Friday afternoon as you close out to ensure that there's a level of positivity and it feels like you've achieved something together. Tiny thing, not hard, but is different. It's about consciously thinking through these new ways that you have to work to create that sense of togetherness. That products like ours, you know, we have a feature called Boosts, which people can select from a library of templates, and a weekly win or a what made your week is one of those things that would prompt you in Microsoft Teams, for example, and then you would respond to it, and it helps just foster some of those good quality interactions.
What part does trust play in hybrid working, Luke? Because if I'm your supervisor or your boss, I can't see what you're doing. I trust you to an extent, but I've got no oversight in the way I would if your cubicle was near my corner office. I can't walk around and check that you're not playing solitaire all day.
Yeah, true that. I think it comes down to traditional exchange values for work was time for money.
Yes.
I think now we're moving to a world where it's evolving to impact for opportunity. And impact is looking at outcomes achieved rather than necessarily levels of hours spent or the amount of tasks completed. I think as soon as you can start to evolve your mindset and the expectation amongst people, then you get yourself in a position where if people are delivering outcomes in line with expectations, do you care if they're at home and they've gone to the gym at lunchtime because that's what they can do?
Yes.
Or if you're demanding presenteeism and digital tools actually give you a much greater level of awareness, ironically, because Teams has a little green dot if you're there and an amber dot if you're not, that you create crazy behaviors if you demand presenteeism, where people run up and they'll move their mouse just so that it looks like they're there. You know, if people aren't going to do the stuff or put in the hours or be present when you want them to, they're going to find a way. You know, that's what humans are like. So I think trust and psychological safety, importantly, are super important in making hybrid work. I think how people can create trust consciously is often in transparency and is often in this evolution to these interaction habits again, which is how do you boost visibility of how people are contributing? You know, how do you regularly have conversations where if you don't feel like you're getting enough, you share that stuff. So it doesn't go hidden. You don't build up this false sense of perception that isn't actually the reality. Because a lot of leadership is about this bridge between perception and reality, like what you perceive is going on versus what is actually going on. If you don't have the interaction habits, you have less chance for those conversations, which means that you're not actively managing performance well, but you're also probably creating disconnection with your colleague too.
And the challenge for professional firms is that they've been ruled by the timesheet and the chargeable hour and the billable hours billing the clients. And even in 6-minute increments, Luke, you're familiar with that world. We've moved on hopefully a little bit now, but every hour and second is accounted for. But we don't want to punish people for doing a more efficient job more quickly and taking time off to pick the kids up from school.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And the reality is those people that are probably picking their kids up from school are actually intrinsically motivated, that want to do a great job, and therefore they're logging on for 2 hours in the evening. So that half an hour that you lost from them, they've probably balanced their life more effectively and given you more. You know, I read a fascinating stat that over the last 15 years or whatever it is that we've had mobile phones and then emails on phones, people have contributed to organizations on average about another 90 minutes a day, I think the stat was.
Wow.
To their working pattern, just because the availability of email on their phone, which is work, you know, responding to an email is work, especially when you work in a kind of information or knowledge-based job like your audience will. Let's
talk about the word culture. If we looked it up in the Luke Fisher Dictionary of Life and Business, in Rob Brown's dictionary, it just said the soup of work. That soup, that drink that we all live in there. But you're more refined on this, Luke. How would you define culture?
I think the problem often with culture.
So you're hesitating, aren't you? Because it is such a complex word these days.
I think it's the scale that makes it complicated, because people think about it from an organizational standpoint. If you broke it down to just one team, rather than the combination of loads of teams, you would look at the ways in which things get done, the behavioral patterns, fundamentally habits rule our life, whether they're in our personal life or in our work life.
Agreed.
So the habitual patterns of the team is effectively the culture, and they're influenced by the people, the processes, and the jobs that they need to get done. It's the heart of collaboration. As soon as you then look at it through the lens of pockets rather than an organizational context, it's easy to understand. As soon as you add another team that has slightly different behavioral patterns and social norms, it gets complicated. As soon as you then add 1,000 teams, because you're in a 5,000 person organization, it almost becomes very, very difficult to identify with and understand, and then in turn influence. But if you narrow it down to something really, really small, in my mind, it's just the behavioral patterns that are influenced by a couple of those kind of core fundamentals.
One of the attractions for modern day employees, and I'm talking really about the younger generation, is well-being. Mental health is at a premium. Accountancy as a profession has been an environment where traditionally it's not a place where you admit that you're struggling. It's not a place where you can show any vulnerability. And leaders have not had that, hey, I'm just like you, I'm struggling with things too, and the workload and everything else. So mental health and resilience come at a premium now, and employees want to know that if I step into your firm and give you my pound of flesh or whatever that is, I will be looked after, not just financially and not even just with a good working culture, but that I will have support when things go wrong or I'm overloaded or I'm not coping. So speaking to that well offering, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because most people think about well-being when something's gone, let's quote unquote, wrong.
Yeah,
you know,
a breakdown,
like a break point often, which is like, how do you give people help and support them? Well-being's there all the time, right? I think there's a couple of key things. One is, if you want to drive sustainable performance, sustainability comes from a good state of well-being, because otherwise you won't be able to repeat the levels of success if you compromise so much and drive burnout or break, people to breaking point. You'll have to go through and find new people to fulfill those jobs, because the people that were there before don't have the opportunity to do it because you've driven them to breaking point. So in a complex talent market where people are already struggling with hiring levels and retention, it makes it even more complicated.
Yeah.
The second thing is that I did a webinar recently with a great company that we work with called Awaris that support leadership development. They've got an evidence base to team science, which is rare because most of the leadership books don't actually build it on a kind of data set and normally based upon opinions. They have, and again, I can share this with you, the single biggest predictor of all of the habit areas that they look at in the way that teams operate and function that drive performance, the single biggest one correlated to improved performance is psychological safety.
Wow.
At the heart of psychological safety and trust within teams, there's two parts to trust, broadly speaking. One is in predictability-based trust. So the more that we work together, the more I have an understanding of how you might respond based upon my actions.
Okay.
Predictability-based trust. The other one is vulnerability-based trust, which is being willing to be vulnerable and therefore expose something that you might need help or support with that puts you at risk in some way, shape, or form. So being in a position where a sense of vulnerability, not at the point of breaking point, but at the point in everyday interaction, is actually one of those biggest predictors of team performance.
Yeah. Because
it supports psychological safety. So I think in the main, actually, I think it's an awareness challenge. I think because the absence of data and understanding of what does it take to really drive a high performance team, most managers have been promoted based upon their technical capability or their length of tenure, not their understanding of leadership. And therefore you end up in these situations, right? That it's hard to change organizations because that middle management layer is a bit sticky and tough sometimes, but it's often because they're not equipped for what does the future of work really look like?
Yeah. When companies bring you in, they've obviously got to be good enough to stand aside from what's going on in their company and be a little bit more impartial and acknowledge that they need help. But too often we get so wrapped up in our own jobs, our own roles, our own cultures, that we either don't see anything's wrong, or we know that something's wrong, but we don't know what it is and we don't know what to do about it. So what kind of thinking process would a leader go through to acknowledge what problems there are and the kind of things you solve, and even get to the point, Luke, where they would pick up the phone and seek you out and say, hey, can you help with this? What would need to be happening and what would they be thinking about?
Yeah, sure. Like most things conform to a simple feedback loop, right? Whether we know that it's happening or it's not, there's normally a point of insight where you go, oh, that wasn't as I thought it was. Okay. And therefore it creates a level of awareness and then in turn acknowledgement that action is required if you want to change the result. So those things typically would be, for us, that you're struggling to attract or retain people. So you might see that you have very high attrition. You know, the average cost per hire based upon the last research report I read is about 22K. So for every person you're losing, not just to rehire them, but to retrain them and to get them up to full capacity, it's probably about 22K's worth of expenditure. I had a conversation with somebody this morning, and like, oh, we employ 500 people and we're losing them at 25%. If you put that through a 22K cost per hire, it's 2.6 million pounds a year.
Goodness.
Like, it doesn't, your audience can probably do far quicker maths than I can for their organization. Yeah. But it doesn't take a lot to go, wow, that makes quite a big difference to the performance of the organization. So attrition's normally a good indicator. If your job application volume's down and you're struggling to attract, probably means that you're in a position where you're not as differentiated in the market or as desirable as an employer as you think you might be. So it's a good sign. It's normally a trigger to start looking at okay, well, what do we do? The other ones for more emotionally mature organizations that care about their people would be measuring employee engagement levels. So those more progressed would be doing it probably quarterly. So the results of that employee engagement survey normally has levels of understanding within that says you're performing poorly here and it's important to your people. And for the leader, which isn't looking at just the organization's view for the exec team scorecard, but looking at their area, often those results see major variation underneath the headline number. That if you do want to create a people first organization, you need to take action off the back of that. So high attrition, poor employee engagement scores, or often we find another trigger would be they know they need to make a step change in performance levels, might have just been backed by private equity, for example, that goes, oh, okay, injection of cash. Now we need 5 to 7 years. There's a catalyst that drives a requirement for change at a faster rate. And therefore that might be, okay, what do we need to do? What are the actions that we need to take? And then we would typically improve those results, is what people introduce us to.
What's happening in accounting and fintech too, you'll be aware, Lucas, there's a lot of M&A activity. Yeah. So new cultures coming in, new firms being bought, new brands being subsumed under old brands, cultures being merged. And you put a Coca-Cola culture next to a Panda Pops culture, and that's a difficult job, isn't it?
Completely. And I think the reason it's a difficult job is because most people make decisions based upon their emotions and then seek to back them up rationally.
Yeah.
And therefore we're in a position in which we don't consider how it must feel to be going through the change. Therefore, we don't acknowledge it. So people kind of rationally accept it. We've been bought, things are going to change, but they don't actually commit to it. So you need to try and create, in that situation in particular, like a level of emotional commitment. How you do that is normally at a more localized level, leveling the playing field. This is how it was before. This is how it was before for you. What do we want our new way of working to look like? It comes back for me down to those behavioral patterns, those habits, rituals, routines that the teams work within, that then over the big picture of the company is what your culture looks like and feels like.
And presumably your work would handle accounting firms and fintech firms and all kinds of sectors. Would it, your methodology, your approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, within professional services firms, you do tend to find the partner creates an element of a silo. The silo has an element of a subculture that is slightly different to the rest. It's accounting, legal firms, etc., are all fairly consistent from a cultural standpoint, but inconsistent when you look inside of the organization because of these reasons, which is also fine, you know. But I think if you're wanting to build a really good place to work for your people, we could absolutely help.
Well, we've gone a little bit longer than we normally do on this show, Luke, but it's a fascinating conversation that will go down well with our listeners and watchers. I'm going to ask you 3 questions to finish, if I may, and I'll flag them in advance for you. And it's the practical end of the episode here, where I'm going to ask you for your best tips for companies to increase engagement, to increase interaction. You called it connection. We could call that communication. And your best tips for leaders in setting culture, particularly in a hybrid working environment. What could they do? So let's go back to that first one. 1 or 2 tips to increase engagement in any company, in any firm.
I would say focus on the positives, because very often it's easy to get completely subsumed by the negatives, the things going wrong. Create time to, even if it's just a weekly win on a Friday afternoon, something that's gone well, because we need a lot more positive reinforcement than we do negatives. I would say that'll make a big difference. The other one is, in the way that our lives are typically run, is via our calendar. If you want to create sustainable levels of investment in your people, or just headspace for you to think about how you can lead better, steal some of your own time with a calendar invite that you actually stick to.
That's really good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about connection. People need to belong. They need to feel like they're part of something. It cuts across engagement, but they don't want to be isolated. They don't want to be at home in their kitchen or their bedroom with a laptop and that's work. So they've got to feel like they're part of something bigger. Any tips for connection?
Yeah, 2, I would say. One is think clearly about your rituals, the unique things that your team do that stick and people like. If you don't have any of them, try some till the point that you find one that people like.
What would be an example, Luke, of a ritual?
A shutdown routine on a Friday, where people can join, have a chit chat that is unrelated to anything related to work, maybe, or actually just free space to chat. You know, maybe if you want to bring along a beer or glass of wine or something like that, cool. But Fridays typically, even for hybrid organizations, are the day that people work from home, but it's also the closure of the week, and being able to bookend it can often make a big difference. The other one is a really simple one that people don't do that well, because video conferencing has made it quite hard to do, which is turn taking, facilitating opportunity for people to share their opinion in quite a conscious state as the meeting facilitator. There's nothing worse. I'm sure anyone that leads a team has been in this situation where everybody's sat on Zoom or Teams. You can evidently see that the mute button's on, and you're in a position where you feel difficult or awkward when nobody responds. The art of kind of creating the space where people want to feel like they can contribute, and different ways to do that, whether it's encouraging it in chat, whether it's facilitating it effectively with a short exercise that breaks it up on something like Miro, the kind of online whiteboard. Any of those things that create opportunity for people to talk up, share their thoughts and views, will make a massive difference. Small thing, big difference.
That's great. And finally, what about the leaders? How do they model a good culture? How do they set an example of how they want their people to behave and things they want them to do?
I think you've said the answer in the question, to be honest, which is role model. Like, it's very easy to tell other people to do the things that you want them to do when you don't do them yourself.
Very easy.
If you want to be in a position where you do something like the weekly wins, share one, see what happens.
Yes.
Share one the following week and see what happens. and invite contribution. And I bet before you know it, people will be sharing it. But don't sit back and believe that it's everyone else's problem, because the art of leadership is, being the one that behaves in the new brave way first, no matter how small it feels. So give it a go first, expect people to follow.
Well, look, Fisher, we'll put your contact details and links into the show notes so people can reach out to you. But that's been extraordinarily insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your passion and your experience today.
Thanks for having me. Much appreciated. I'll see you soon.